I think I have to say that I think that the issue that, at least in my experience, in and around academia, generates the most controversy and the most hostility, the most aggressiveness, whether it's Freud, whether it's Derrida, whether it's Heidegger, and so on, is where the status of self-consciousness is called into question, and in connection with that, the status of meaning. Because for me, the unity of meaning and the unity of self-consciousness are interrelated. Self-consciousness is unified if meaning is unified, and meaning is unified if self-consciousness is unified. If, as Luther is saying, you can't move from your perceptions, let's say, to a sure and certain idea of what they signify, then your own relation to yourself is up in the air. I mean, it's open, it's uncertain. And that's where anxiety can come into the picture. And aggression can be a way of responding to anxiety, and is often a way, I believe, of responding to anxiety. And I think that's, in my opinion, that's what generates the real hostility in many, many countries and cultures against Freud. It's not sexuality, it's the implications of sexuality for the idea of self-consciousness. Same thing with Heidegger, same thing with Derrida, etc., and with Nietzsche up to a point as well. That's my sense. And the reason why this becomes a cause of anxiety and in turn then of aggressivity is because it calls into question the ability of the self to control its relation to the world. And the idea of control is very important, I think, in all of this. To the extent that you're living in an uncertain world, one wants to have the idea of being able to control. And if you can't be sure of your own relationship to yourself and so on, then this idea of control becomes all the more, open to question. What does it involve, and so on. And I'm not saying this involves a kind of total abdication of, sort of total passivity. I don't believe that's the alternative. But there's a big difference if you think you can control, let's say, problems through essentially military response, or if you can control it through negotiations, trying to change conditions, etc., more complex, but not so directly. The militarization of the response to anxiety or problems or threats is, I think, a very serious problem that we have, in which today, which concerns me a lot. And again, the book Targets of Opportunity tries in its own way to try to talk a little bit about that. Okay, so we move now some 100 years more, a little bit more ahead from the early 15th to now the 16th century, I believe, yeah. And Descartes, by the way, also participated in the 30 Years' War. He was an advisor, and he knew geometry very well, and he was involved in artillery and ballistics, which was fought mainly in Germany, on German soil and so on.
That's why he did the Cartesian flame, right?
Exactly. Yeah, he was one of the people who worked a lot in ballistics and so on, and defense, and so on. He is, and it's interesting that he writes some of his major works in Holland, because I think he feels safer there, because although he's not directly challenging the way Luther is, the authority of the Catholic Church, indirectly I think he is. He's, in fact, he's challenging all, he's calling into question all constituted authority, you see. And that's something you can't do just as a kind of thought experiment, not at least that time, and probably not today either. So simply, he is writing this from a kind of position of exile in a more tolerant, Dutch context there. And just to get again to make one point clear, what Benjamin claims about the Reformation is again not that it is primarily important or exclusively as a religious movement per se, but that it raises certain questions and problems about the relation to institutions, to authority, that cover all institutions, and that goes through both religions or major Christian religions, and that are not just a question of Protestant, Catholic, or anything like that, but that the effort then to justify any authority is much harder and much more problematic as a result of the experiences that Luther is articulating. That's sort of the argument. And I think that Descartes is an interesting example of that, because in Descartes you get both the acknowledgement of the problem and an effort to overcome it. And the effort to overcome it will be in this withdrawal onto a kind of individual self-consciousness, you see. But maybe we can look at some of I'd like to read some of this stuff with you to get a sense of it. Just the opening, these are the first meditations. So several years have now elapsed since I first became aware that I had accepted, even from my youth, many false opinions for true, and that consequently what I afterward based on such principles is highly doubtful. And from that time I was convinced of the necessity of undertaking once in my life to rid myself of all the opinions I had adopted, and of commencing anew the work of building from the foundation. Here you get this metaphor, the architectonic metaphor is going to be very, very dominant in a lot of modern, that is from the 16th, 17th, 18th century. Kant also will talk, for example, in the critical philosophy of, it's absolutely, you must have a firm critical foundation. That's what the three critiques are trying to do. They're not producing positive knowledge of the world. They're producing knowledge of what it is, how we know, and how we can, on that basis, then the individual sciences like anthropology and so on will be able to proceed. But it's the idea of the building of the foundation. But it's also interesting here that right away from the very beginning, it's not just building from the foundation. If I desired to establish a firm and abiding superstructure in the sciences. Now, it's the word, the connecting of firm and abiding that I want to call your attention to. Because you could think of the constructivist metaphor, as many have, in a totally spatial kind of thinking, which it is in a sense. But it's spatial also in relation to time. And what's very, very important, that what I'm going to be trying to sort of bring out in some of the reading of this, is that part of what the challenge of the Reformation has to do with a different experience of time as lived by finite human beings. Because prior to the Reformation, let's be very simplistic about it, human beings are born sinful, and there's an Augustinian model there. But the idea is that time, although it's passing away of finite living beings, is also the potentiality of resurrection and of redemption. And so time is always an ambiguous medium. It takes away, but it has the possibility, ultimately, of creating the conditions under which things that are taken away will be restored, will be restituted, and so on, you see. And so there's an ambiguous relation to time, but it's not totally negative by any sense. With Luther and so on, with the questioning of the ability of an institution like the Catholic Church to dispense grace or to organize grace and everything that connected to that in the visible sense world of senses, the experience of time becomes much more severe, much more menacing, because the only thing, and that's why I emphasized Luther at the beginning, where he says the Catholic Church, has no authority or power to dispense grace or forgiveness beyond the span of a human lifetime. So, in other words, time then becomes unequivocally for the living human being the time not so much of self-restoration, but of perishing. Of the sinful being guilty. And the only thing that then can intervene is something that's outside of time, that has no direct, visible, or ascertainable presence. It is supposed to be in time. Luther says it has to, faith, you have to feel this, you have to be affected by it, it has to change you, and so on. But it's basically functioning beyond time, outside of time. That exposes human beings to an experience of time that is very, very negative. This is what I'm suggesting there. And that one strand of that, because you have different strands, you'll have an Enlightenment strand where time will be essentially a progressive fulfillment of collectives, Vico, Herder, Hegel. History is a kind of universal history of self-fulfillment, but you also have as a kind of shadowing that, the sense of time as a medium that is uncompromisingly that of ephemerality, of passing away, and of decomposition, as it were. See? And it seems to me that it's already, if you ask it, what is he reacting against, already in these very opening lines of the Meditations, what he's saying, in order for something to be firm, it has to be lasting. See, it has to be abiding. I.e., everything that he has experienced up to now, based on convention and consensus and custom, it does not fulfill that. Otherwise, it wouldn't be necessary to do this radical cure that he's trying to do there. So, and time is all over this first paragraph, in the sense that he's aging, and he hopes he's reached just the right moment where he's still in command of his faculties. He has enough experience to be able to try something really heroic, but he isn't too far along, so that he's already losing it. You see, he says, but as this enterprise appeared to me to be one of great magnitude, I waited until I had attained an age so mature as to leave me no hope that at any stage of life more advanced I should be better able to execute my design. You know, the word maturity is very interesting in there. It comes up in a lot of different contexts. It's sort of interesting that you use the word maturity in English to describe human beings, but you use the word ripening to describe organic. You know, why is that? I think it's because the idea of maturity stresses an ideal of self-fulfillment, whereas ripening is part of a process that just keeps on going, and at a certain point you become overripe, and you begin to decompose, and that's maturity. You have immaturity and you have maturity. That's it. You don't have over-maturity or ex-maturity, there. So you have there two separate. He's writing this in Latin, by the way, and I have to check the Latin on that to see what he uses, the things he uses there. But it is interesting that that you have a process here which is trying to pin it just at the point. He's acknowledging implicitly that he has a certain limited amount of time, and that he has to choose the right moment. But the idea of maturity allows him to think, I'm choosing just the moment where I'm at full faculty, and not the moment where I might be on the verge of passing from ripeness into over-ripeness, et cetera,
How old is he here, approximately?
I think he's in his mid-50s.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So if he's in Holland already, this is after he's been run out of France. Right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So he's close to the end of his life at this point. Does he die in Holland?
He dies, but it's a bit later, about 10 years later.
It's 10 years later. Okay.
Yeah, so he's quite mature in doing that here. On this, because he doesn't say it that way. He's saying, I want it to be at full and so on. On this account, I've delayed so long that I henceforth consider that I was doing wrong were I still to consume in deliberation any of the time that now remains for action. Giorgio Agamben has a book called Le Temps qui Reste, the time that now remains for action. So he's aware that there's a limited space of time, and he's got to get just, now is the time, now or never, there. And today, then, since I've opportunely freed my mind from all cares, and since I'm in the secure possession of leisure, in a peaceable retirement, I will at length apply myself earnestly and freely to the general overthrow of all my former opinions. So in a way, you see how this is a very radical project, basically, which in that sense, this is why I would put him very much in the tradition of the Post-Reformation, basically. Or what Benjamin's theory, not just of the German Baroque, not just of the tragedies he's studying there, but I would argue of modernity more generally. He calls it's the modernity of counter-reformation. In other words, what does that mean? Usually counter-reformation is identified with Catholicism, but he doesn't mean it that way. I think he means it in the way of the fact that you have to respond to this new sense of the dilemma of singular living beings who are mortal and who are no longer guaranteed access through their voluntary actions to a abiding identity. It's almost as if, and this is what's going to come out of the discussion here, is that in order to be oneself, or in order to be identity, you have to be able to stay the same over time. Maybe not be immortal, but at least you have to stay the same over time to be identifiable, you see. And that's going to be the issue. Do human beings, is it there possible for them? You see, it seems to me that if you go back and you read some of the things I read from Luther, when he says you can't even be sure of your own contrition, you see, he's saying, therefore, you can't be sure because you are so estranged from yourself as a fallen temporal mortal being that you can't simply by your own bootstraps, as it were, lift yourself up above that situation. You have to have faith, but faith means is a gift. It's not something you can command or will. And he launches there the problem of the will that will return with Schopenhauer, with Nietzsche, in all kinds of different configurations. You see, the will becomes crucial in the situation of the Reformation, post and counter Reformation. There, you see, what is possible? What can be willed? What is I mean, in Nietzsche, you get a very paradoxical, at least notion of what the will to power is, and it's certainly not the will to be able to abide in any kind of traditional sense. It's not that. Whatever else. In fact, that's why power becomes an issue for Nietzsche, because power intervenes where you no longer have a stable sense of being, where everything is caught up in a process of change and of becoming, as he puts it there. So the first thing is that then is this withdrawal, and the reason that I find this also very interesting for the uncanny is that you have a very curious kind of mix. Here's Descartes, no longer in his home base, in his home country, because it's a little bit dangerous for him, finding refuge in Holland in order to start this process of seeking some sort of certainty, of seeking a response to the Reformation, to the Lutheran, seeking the certainty that he become aware that he really can't rely on the institutions or convention or senses supplying him. And he's going to describe himself as being in a very domestic type of setting. He's sitting in front of a fireplace in his bathrobe and so on. Very rare that a philosopher would describe himself. I mean, Plato is out, Socrates is outside walking around. It's very, not in the Symposium, but in a lot of the, and so on. Aristotle, peripatetic. And here you have, on the border of the city, here you have him in a domestic setting, sort of closed, safe, having excluded everything, but no longer at home. And I think that is sort of already a kind of genealogy of the uncanny. I'm assuming, but I should mention this. The uncanny is the English translation of the German, which is unheimlich. And the German unheimlich means to be not at home, to be unhomely. And of course, what is unique about both Freud and to a certain extent Heidegger and Derrida's interpretation is that the unhomely and the homely, far from excluding each other as opposites, converge. In other words, you are least at home when you're most at home. See? And if you think that is some sort of Freudian ingenuity, then just think about domestic violence. The violence, one of the huge violence that's committed, is violence in the home among members, usually from the patriarchal, but not always. Within the home, the phenomenon of domestic violence doesn't come from outside. It comes from, very often, not always, from within what's familiar within the home. And it's going to be that a little bit, that idea. That I think is one of the key points of the uncanny, at least as I understand it there. And I see that. What I should of course add, and excuse me if you've read this elsewhere. I think I have written about it somewhere. Is that I do think that it is something very characteristic of of Western modernity, is the sense of being the desire to be at home, but also the discovery that at home is where one is most threatened in some sense, or most ill at ease in a way. And there's a kind of back and forth, there. See, and at least that's part of the. What Descartes is going to try to do in these meditations, the first and second meditations, is try to describe a way of being at home with oneself, even though one is cut off from the history and institutions that one grew up with. So it's a strange kind of home. It's a second home, if you will, but it's a second home that's necessary because of the unreliability of the first home. That's the key. It's true that when you read the Meditations, he seems to be speaking about sense experience. But if you read it carefully, you realize that as with Luther, he's not just talking platonically about the senses being unreliable. He's talking about the institutions that organize the sense world, the world of senses, the world we live in, as being equally unreliable. So those are, religious, educational, political, social, all of these institutions, all of the conventions that. So you see, there you have him continuing and trying to acknowledge and respond to the challenge of Luther that the whole visible, phenomenal world of the senses can no longer be taken at face value, or no longer provides an access to the meaning behind it, as it were. And there has to be, that something else has to be introduced. And Luther will go inside to the heart, to faith, and Descartes will instead try to go into what he calls the thinking being, the self, which is basically then self-consciousness there. One other interesting aspect to this, by the way, feel interrupt at any point. I'm just going to sort of going through. I don't want to read it all, but I want to go through it. Is that he starts out by he's going to slowly, in a way, deconstruct, if that word is possible, everything that seems to be reliable and immediate, such as. That I, at the very bottom of the page, I am in this place, seated by the fire, clothed in a winter dressing gown, and that I hold in my hands this piece of paper and with other intimations of the same nature. Now, with this begins something I think very characteristic that I've been able to follow right up through Nietzsche, Derrida, and what I would call it is a theatricalization or scenerization. The word doesn't exist, it's no good, but bending, in other words, the determine that I am here. Since I'm excluding everything outside, I'm defining a place, an interior, closed-off place. That's where I am. That's what he's describing, the room in which he's in, which is a room both in space and time, removed from his history. And at the same time, he's going to describe it as a scene, and even part of a possible incipient scenario. Here I am in this place before the fire, clothed in a winter dressing gown, that I hold in my hands this piece of paper with other intimations of the same nature. Now I gather some of you have read some of the stuff that I wrote in Theatricality as medium. One of the motifs in that book is that the theatricality involves a redefinition of place, which is and body, but body and place are traditionally associated. And usually, traditionally, if you go back to Aristotle, at least, you find that they're both determined as containers. In other words, place contains one body contains a soul, or a nous, or a mind, or something. So the idea is that you have a format of things being self-contained. That's the word I used to try to describe it. Self-delimited, internal to themselves. And what you get with the scene is an opening, a sense that you have to be physically localized, but that physical localization is no longer in a closed-off space, but always in a space that is open toward the other, in some sense, toward beings. And that's what I mean when I say he's setting the scene here. He's describing a place that's self-enclosed. It's a room, but the fact that he takes the trouble to include that, and that is going to come back to that in the second meditation in a very important way with the piece of wax, you see, is really crucial to his whole demonstration. So it's not just a kind of, rhetorical in the weak sense of the term, strategy. It's something constitutive. That is, that place is no longer a self-contained container, but something that is necessarily open to the other, to the observer, to the listener, to the addressee, and above all, open to time and to space as what I would call media of transformation or alterability. In other words, time and space are no longer directly media of self-fulfillment, they're media of change, media of alterability. There's a big difference, I think, there. One of the things that Luther is emphasizing is that, in other words, if you think as a good Christian that it's enough for you to go to the church, to participate in confession, make certain statements, propositions, and that's evidence of your faith, and that will be rewarded, Luther says you're wrong. You have to be transformed in your entire life, you see. And part of that transformation is that wherever you are, you're somewhere else. You're potentially somewhere else. I think that's the idea. And one of the ways, but it's not a way that Luther would have liked at all, but it's one of the ways in which that can be implemented is through theater. Because in theater, people are in a place, but it's not that simple place. It's a place that is defined by everything that is not in that place, in some sense, by the script, by the lighting, by the audience, and so on. And so there seems to me to be, in connection with this whole process, an opening of the notion of place that is also involves its theatricalization. You see? And so the appeal to the other, whether the other is audience or whoever, patron, and so on, another time, another place, and somewhere else, that does not at all abolish the question of localization, but it means that the locality is no longer self-contained. See, that would be the key, sort of a key point there, I think. And so, and you have to, all of Descartes' writing, one of the things that makes his writing so effective, it seems to me, is that he's writing in with a constant sense of his readers, you see. And there's an interaction going on there. You see in the very next, and it's a very dramatic one, too, in a certain sense. How could I deny that I possess these hands and this body, and withal escape being classed with persons in a state of insanity? In other words, what I'm going to be doing here may seem to, would seem at first sight to be equivalent to being nuts, to be insane. If I say to you that I can't believe what I see with my own two eyes. I see with my own two eyes that I'm here. I just told you where I am. I see these two hands. I see that I have a piece of paper. I'm writing. How could I even begin to think that there's any problem there without you thinking I'm completely crazy, I'm insane, right? And whose brains are so disordered and clouded by dark bilious vapors as to cause them pertinaciously to assert that they are monarchs when they are in the greatest poverty, or clothed in gold and purple when destitute of any covering. In other words, to assert that they're totally different from what they seem to be. You see, in a certain sense, this is what Luther was suggesting, that people are totally different from what they appear, and that if you're not worried about that, he says you should be worried about it. Luther's point is you should be anxious, but that those who are not anxious are the ones to be most worried about it because they are, and so on. And so, in a way, he's staging, it seems to me, Descartes, this whole situation here in a kind of dialogue with his reader, in a very interesting way. He says, for example, or that their head is made of clay. This is, how does he get this idea? It's very interesting. The head is made of clay. The head is that part which is, considered to be the physical site of the soul, of the mind. And here you have the head made of clay. It's a very powerful, I think, very powerful idea. Their body made of glass. It's being, both transparent and fragile, breakable, basically breakable. Or that they are gourds. And this is interesting. This is sort of the negative aspect of the body as container. The body is a gourd, and so on. I should certainly be not less insane than they were I to regulate my procedure according to examples so extravagant. In other words, the examples that he picks here are examples that capture the imagination at the same time that he's using them rhetorically to apparently look at, I'd have to be crazy to think this, that, and the other thing. See, these are kind of what I would say an uncanny use of examples, because at the same time that he seems to be strengthening the position of convention, he's also sowing the suspicion. What does it mean to have a head of clay or to have a body of glass? Where does he get that from, or something? Then, except to be crazy there. And so from then he moves from that. He says, however, I can give you examples that are less extravagant, and the example is, of course, that of sleeping, and dreaming, representing to myself in dreams these same things and others and so on that are less probable, which the insane think of, are present in their waking moments. How often have I dreamt that I was in these familiar circumstances, that I was dressed and occupied this place by the fire where I was lying undressed in bed. At the present moment, however, I certainly look upon this paper with eyes wide awake. The head which I now move is not asleep. I extend this hand consciously and with express purpose. See, he's defending the legitimacy of deliberate conscious action, the kind of thing that Luther was saying could not, cause you to escape your sinful state of self-delusion, basically. Good work. But here it says, I can do it, but I dream this, and so on. The occurrences, and he says, I cannot forget that I've been deceived in sleep by similar illusions, and so on. So it's going to be sleep and dreaming that is really important, is his use there, even though he's already raised the issue of madness through these very striking examples that he gives there. And then so he then follows this argument a little bit further and says, let's suppose that we are dreaming, but even in the case of dreaming, the dream representations have to come from somewhere. They don't just drop in from anywhere. They have some basis, in other words, in reality. Even, he says, artists have to who create satyrs and sirens, do this by taking elements that are familiar, that have a basis in reality, perceptual reality, and composing them together. And so that at least there are simple objects that have to be recognized as being real. And even if their combinations aren't necessarily the unicorn and so on, like that, and that there are certain simple things that one can apparently rely on. And then I'll just jump now to the ninth paragraph, number 9. Nevertheless, the belief that there is a God who is all-powerful and who created me, such as I am, has for a long time obtained steady possession of my mind. How then do I know that he's not arranged that there should be neither earth nor sky nor any extended thing or figure, magnitude, or place, providing at the same time, however, for all the perceptions of all these objects and so on? In other words, how do I know that God, who is all-powerful, has not created me to be in total illusion? It's a little bit like what Luther is in fact seems to be suggesting when he says that Luther creates human beings, but that there's no way that the human beings themselves can induce from their situation that they have any kind of reliable awareness of what this God is like, or in other words, there's a radical otherness to God connected with the notion of all powerfulness and so on, which is and he goes on then to say that some indeed might perhaps be found who would be disposed rather to deny the existence of a being so powerful than to believe that there is nothing certain. But let's for a moment refrain from opposing this opinion. In other words, if you believe in God as all-powerful, does that give you any basis for being sure that your experiences of the world as you know it are reliable, are sure, and so on? On the contrary, does not the idea of the omnipotence of the deity as creator create the possibility of the world being totally different from the way it's experienced? Again, isn't it the difference between human beings and this all-powerful deity that one has to take into account, as well as any similarities that there might be there? And then he says, this is all, of course, in the realm of possibility. To these reasonings I have assuredly nothing to reply. This is section 10. But am constrained at last to avow that there's nothing of all that I formally believe to be true, of which it is impossible to doubt. Now, this is it's an interesting argument. The fact that it's not impossible to doubt everything that he has been taught was true does not per se mean that it's really urgent to doubt it. You see that, or does it? Or does it? This is in other words, why should possibility, the notion of possibility, be an argument for then going ahead and actually doubting, you see? And in other words, what is the relation between possibility and reality? It seems to me that in part there, what he's saying is that we can't, there's an underlying problem which is only partially visible in his argument, and which is such that if we can't exclude beyond all possible doubt, this is the way that the formula is in kind of a trial, the possibility of us being totally deceived, then we can't rely on anything. We can't. It's interesting, but it seems almost like a kind of legal reasoning. Actually, the legal reasoning is different. It's beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a big difference. When you're in a jury or something, the jury has to conclude beyond a reasonable doubt, and his argument here is beyond a possible doubt. If a jury had to conclude beyond a possible doubt, there would be probably very few convictions ever made, there. But this becomes the criteria, and what I think is important here to realize is that there's something more bugging Descartes here in terms of anxiety, in terms of this need, than seems, because that is not a normal argument, because it's possible. Lots of things are possible. If you imagine, if you were worrying about every possible thing that could happen, you'd be totally immobilized. You see, really, because at any moment the sky could fall. You can't eliminate. And this is also, it's also interesting. This is before Hume, but the Hume argument against causality has a lot to do with this, because the desire for causality, the desire to be able to explain in terms of causality, is a desire to control the future. Why? Because if causality, insofar as causality can be relied upon, it's a way of saying things will happen under certain recognized circumstances, as I know they have already happened. See? And then, so that when Hume comes along and says, this is convention, you can never know, he's basically saying anything is possible. The fact that something has happened 10 different times doesn't mean that the 11th time, it won't happen otherwise. And I think this is, this is sort of in the background, and in the last, he says first in the section 11, it's not sufficient to have made these observations. Care must be taken likewise to keep them in remembrance, keep them in memory. For these old and customary opinions perpetually recur, long and familiar usage giving them the right of occupying my mind, even almost against my will, and subduing my belief. In other words, you have to keep in mind that everything that you have been taught to rely on is basically based on a convention that has no authority, that is not reliable. That which you rely on is basically not reliable. In other words, there's a kind of there's a kind of entropy here that's working. If you don't keep constantly reminding yourself that, which you can't do anyway, but if you don't keep constantly this situation in mind, you're going to fall back into, relying on convention, which is what happens anyway, routine, custom, habit, and so on. And in fact, you can't live your life without doing that. But here, there's this really powerful suggestion that there's something very dangerous in doing that. There's something very dangerous that is forcing him to remind you that this is Hume before avant la lettre. Hume before Hume, in some sense. The fact that your custom tells you that things are going to happen in a certain way or things are in a certain way is, not enough for you to rely on. It's also, there's a line that goes right from, Hume through this skepticism to Nietzsche, basically. Nietzsche also is very, Nietzsche then is willing to affirm, whatever that means, that probably reality is chaotic, and that human beings are there trying to deal with that chaos through art, through different ways, but that it is the way it is. It's totally. But he wants that to be affirmed and so on. So it gets very, 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 very complicated in Nietzsche. But he says that if you do this, if you rely too utterly on convention, you risk deceiving yourself. And it's for this reason I'm persuaded that I shall not be doing wrong if, taking an opposite judgment of deliberate design, I become my own deceiver by supposing for a time that all these opinions are entirely false and imaginary. It's very interesting, the use of supposition there, because de Man has an article, I think it's in Allegories of Reading, perhaps one of the articles there, in which he notes how many of Nietzsche's declarations are prefixed by the idea, suppose that, or let it be supposed that. And a lot of Nietzsche's, takes his form of hypothesis, which is in a certain sense the only consistent kind of position that he could take, given his basic sense of a kind of chaotic and opaque relation to reality that individuals have, and it's very much in this tradition that I'm sketching. So, and then he winds up. Then he said, "I'm going to." Basically, he's trying to, I think, take up the Luther's challenge, saying that those who think their good works are salvational are the most dangerous and deluded, and so on. And it's only when you're aware of that problem that you have a possibility of seeing clearly and of possibly acceding through faith and not, to grace. And that's a little bit of what he's saying here, in that I'm going to assume that everything that I counted on, everything that was taught to me, everything that society tells us, and ultimately the deity, I will suppose then not that deity was sovereignly good and fountain of truth, but that some malignant demon, who is at once exceedingly potent and deceitful, has employed all his artifice to deceive me. So there's a kind of spin-off, a kind of malignant God, a malignant spin-off of God, malignant angel, who is there precisely to deceive him. And I will consider myself as without hands, eyes, flesh, blood, or any of the senses, and as falsely believing that I am possessed of these. So there's a kind of sense of radical physical dispossession. And he's going to, I continue resolutely fixed in this belief, hoping that I'll do at least what is in my power and guard with settled purpose against giving any assent to what's false and being imposed upon by this deceiver, whether it be his power or artifice. In other words, this scenario here that Descartes is introducing as a way of establishing an absolute certainty, something that's absolutely reliable, is already very close to a kind of horror film. And very, there's a kind of malignant deceiver who is there, and I'm going to suppose that I have to deal with that and see if there's any antidote that I can find to compensate that. So that sort of sets the scene for then the second meditation, which we'll look at after our break. The problem in Nietzsche then is to explain the traumatic sense of discovery or being overpowered with which that thought comes to him. So the thought, there are a couple of elements in the Nietzsche eternal return that have to be, I think, distinguished. One is the sense of being overwhelmed by the fact that this is, he says this is unlike anything that has ever been thought before. And what it is, it's the return of the like. I call it, by the way, the eternal recurrence of the like, not of the same, because it uses a word that's a little ambiguous there. And he introduced it by saying, what happened to me then is unlike anything. This terrible thought, this thought is unlike everything. And the problem is that if it returns identically, it must return with the same traumatic element of discovery and of being overwhelmed, which is not just discovery, being overwhelmed. And in that case, the I to which that returns, and it's very important that it's I, that's what distinguishes his notion of eternal return from a cosmological one, is always different in being the same. It's because it always has to be surprised. There's no memory. You see, there's no memory. The discovery is that this may have already been there and may already come in the future, or must.
There is memory, but I think your translation, when you take it as the like, not the same, is very pivotal, because it isn't the same. So the shock of it, that first feeling of it, you have changed, and you do have the memory of the past, but what has come back is not exactly the same as what you have seen before. You will have another shock of a different type, and this will.
Yeah, but that's not the way the thought is presented to him by the demon. It says everything will be the same. This moonlight, this spider, everything will be exactly the same. Nothing, so there's no change in a certain sense. The only thing that changes is your attitude toward what you're doing because of this possibility or the necessity, whatever, of it returning and it already returning and so on. So I see it as an extremely conflictual, impossible idea. An impossible idea that, however, grows out of this same desire for things to stay the same over time. The same need for that, but it's a reductio ad absurdum. That's my understanding of it.
Couldn't you take it more along the lines of like his aphorisms in Beyond Good and Evil, and take it along the lines of just towards the reaffirmation of what you do and not the regret?
This is the point. I mean,
into the roads of power.
Yes, paradoxically, I think there are different. If you don't mind us getting into a little bit of discussion of Nietzsche's eternal return, which is related to the uncanny anyway, with repetition and so on. But the way I try to sort of distinguish it in my mind is that there are different forms of the eternal return, of the thought or experience of the eternal return. And it really depends on the interpreter there is the overwhelming discovery of it, which threatens to just blow him apart, and which is described in certain texts, such as the gay science and Zarathustra primarily. And then afterwards, there's his returning to this thought of the eternal return, where it becomes really a thought, the way Heidegger, but not an experience of being overpowered. And I'm not sure it's the same eternal return. You see, the one is a conceptualization of it, and the other is an experience. I call it an encounter. An encounter, the experience of an encounter that's actually, literally, I think, quite traumatizing. That it presents itself as traumatizing. And so I read for example, the Vision and the Riddle very carefully as a scene, and I would try to relate this experience that he has, which nobody ever talks about. Heidegger talks about it, but it really, where he hears a dog howling, and he says, "Did I ever hear a dog howling like that before?" And he says, "Yes, I heard a dog howling when I was a child." A dog, I have to have the text of it there, but he says there was the moon was shining off the metal roof of the house, and the dog was howling at that because dogs believe in ghosts and thieves. He says dogs believe in ghosts. In other words, the scene he describes there in his memory that comes back in memory acoustically. It's very interesting for this whole question of acoustics. I want to, maybe we can even talk about that or something, because it's an acoustical memory. He hears the dog howling, and that brings back a visual image of an acoustical sound. Again, the dog is howling, but the dog is howling in response to the perception of the moon shining off the metal roof. And then he says dogs because dogs believe in ghosts and thieves. In other words, the moon is stealing. The dog is howling because the dog is afraid of the moon stealing the home, the roof, the house, away from the rightful owner, the master, whoever the master is. And the dog is terrified and is howling to protect the home. So in that sense, it's a very uncanny image. And it's very interesting how Heidegger deals with this. Heidegger couldn't be more contemptuous of this little scene, which is very powerful. When you read this, I think it's one of the most powerful parts in this vision and the riddle, where in Zarathustra he describes the eternal return. And Heidegger deals with it strictly as a transitional stage, and he couldn't be more scornful of the poor dog. He says this dog is, this howling, barking dog is not, is afraid of its own shadow. In fact, the dog is responding to the fear of dispossession that the eternal return implies, ironically. In other words, the desire is to possess, is to be oneself, staying the same over time by everything returning identically. But in fact, this identical return of the same tends to dispossess rather than to possess, just as the way doubling tends to dispossess as well as possess, because it's no longer under the voluntary control of a unified I, but it's something that happens. It's the moon coming back. It's this memory that imposes itself of a reflected light, not an original light, not the light of the sun, but the light of the moon, and suggesting for the dog the idea of thieves stealing the house away and of ghosts coming back. So the idea, again, it's the connected between the idea of the ghost, the afterlife, and but it's extremely complicated. I don't pretend to have, but it is extremely powerful, and it's very important, I think, for this experience of this encounter of Nietzsche with the experience of the eternal return. It's not yet a thought. It's not far from a theory. And later on, it becomes something more he thinks back about, and he tries to theorize it and conceptualize it. And I don't think it's the same thing anymore. He's no longer experiencing it. Whereas the initial description of it is very much in the Lutherian mode of being overwhelmed by something, by an experience that changes you, even while overcoming you in some sense there. So very complicated. Okay, let's now we still have a little bit of time. Look at the second meditation now. Again, it begins, I take the metaphors here as very, the metaphors for me, which have a rhetorical function, I take as least as important as the rest of it here. He says at the very beginning, the meditation of yesterday has filled my mind with so many doubts that it's no longer in my power to forget them. I'm so overwhelmed. Again, this is this idea I can't, nor do I see, meanwhile, any principle on which they can be resolved. And just as if I had fallen all of a sudden into very deep water, sense of drowning, I am so greatly disconcerted as to be unable to either plant my feet firmly on the bottom or sustain myself by swimming on the surface. I think that, for me, tells us something. It's not just it is a rhetorical ploy, but it also tells us something about a real anguish that's there. Because the rhetorical ploy only works, I'm not saying, I have no idea what Descartes was feeling or thinking, but for something like this to be effective, it has to tap in to an anxiety that the readers have, that people have, you see, that will allow them to go along with it. And it's this idea of really having nothing, no solid ground under one's feet, and losing one's life, because if you go under, you lose your life. That's why it's not just being shaken up. It's really whether one can survive, or not. It's a question of survival in some sense there. and the only hope of surviving for Descartes, and this is why what comes later on is not, I don't think it's necessarily a cop-out, but it's sort of a result of the dilemma that he's in, is of finding an Archimedean point, one thing that is certain and indubitable. And this is what precisely the Lutheran experience, if one wants to call it that, the Lutheran challenge is denying. You can have faith, but it's a little bit like Kant will say with the categorical imperative. You can never know for sure that your faith is going to save you, that your faith is genuine, that your faith is going to redeem you, you see. All you can do is you know that you can't know. You can accept that uncertainty. It seems to me that the Lutheran position moves toward an acceptance of uncertainty, which is very difficult, and so which therefore has to be toned down and so on and so forth, and which produces then, as a response, this desire to find the one point, and it's that one Archimedean point that is the theological point, really, because the only point that one can imagine that would not be affected by the uncertainty of the moral being is that of God. And the question is, how do we relate to that? How we need it, or this culture needs it, and nevertheless doesn't know how to, or is going to try to get to it through various ways, and we get then in section 3 here the first answer, the main answer of Descartes, which we've already anticipated, namely the I. Why suppose such a being? Is there not a God or some being, by whatever name I may designate him, who causes these thoughts to arise in my mind? But why suppose such a being? In other words, that's the situation, you see, of the Post-Reformation, that the supposition of such a being, you can suppose it, but it won't help you, per se, give you the certainty. The presupposition of a divine creator, which Luther never doubts, does not suffice to give fallen human individuals that point of security that they feel they need in their suffering. And so here's where you get the shift there. Why suppose such a being? Of course, he's going to go on and suppose it anyway in the later meditations, and so on. But here he's going to say, for it may be I myself am capable of producing them. You see, the I is going to produce, that is, in some sense, take the place of the Creator. Not because the Creator is doubted or not that, because the Creator God is not sufficient to help the fallen human creature out of its cares, out of its dilemma, and so on. Instead of that, it's going to devolve on the human, which is what Luther refuses in a certain sense, or he only relegates to faith. But this is going to be quite different, to take up that challenge. For it may be I myself am capable of producing them. Am I? No, it's a kind of negative creation. I may be producing delusions. I may be producing antimatter. I may be producing, black holes. But I am doing something, and therefore I am. See, so this is one quintessential sort of response to that. It's not a positive creator. It's a kind of negative creator, and that what that leaves you with is then the reduction of the pure producing subject, producing nothing that can be, but being in producing. Therefore, because doing something, and therefore in that process of doing something, existing, and therefore having that's going to be the point at which he tries to get out of this dilemma. Am I then at least not something? I may be producing delusions, fictions, and so on, illusions, but even in so doing, I'm doing something. But I before deny that I possess senses or a body. I hesitate, however, for what follows from that. Am I so dependent on the body and the senses that without these I cannot exist? Again, the question is there an I that is individuated, separate from the body, which is a sign of a fallen existence. You see, what individuates the I? What makes the I and not something else? I means not something else. It implies individuation of some sort. And so this is the question. The body is fallen. In what way then can there be an I but I had the persuasion that there was absolutely nothing in the world. There was no sky, no earth, neither minds nor bodies. Was I not therefore at the same time persuaded that I did not exist? This argument seems to me to be interesting because it does two things. On the one hand, it flirts with the destruction of the world. It's basically saying if there's no world, if the world is destroyed, if the world is absent, nevertheless, I may still exist. I may, and this is, I think, interesting in connection with the apocalypse and so on. And the other thing is that it flirts with its own life by saying that I may not have a body, I may be in a world that's not a world, but whatever else is happening, I am still doing something. You see, so there's a kind of self-sacrificial reduction going on here that is, there may be no sky, no earth, I may have no body, and so on. And he says, was I not therefore persuaded that I did not exist? Far from it. That's the term. I assuredly existed since I was persuaded. See? So, in other words, the process of this dialogue that's going on, this thinking that's going on, is evidence that something exists. And, of course, the question is, what is that something that exists? And for Descartes, it's the I. Nietzsche later on will say, does every doing presuppose a doer? Does every action presuppose an actor? Does every act presuppose a subject? Can things happen without it necessarily being? And in the uncanny, you get, for example, robots and puppets and so on, which are doing things and which are not living human beings, and become, as in the Sandman, the object of desire, precisely, in some reason, as that. So after this, you're going to get a whole series of stagings of the problematic relation between things going on, things happening, and the question of whether or not these things that are happening can be used as evidence of the existence of something like an I, and if so, in what sense? You see, must there be a doer every time there's a deed? That's Nietzsche's form of that. For Descartes, there's no question there, but that is the point at which all later modern philosophy will then, connect to and try to and see as unsatisfactory and try to develop, namely that something may be going on, but is that evidence of what we call an I, what can be legitimately called an I? For Descartes, it is, although with a very interesting problematic restriction. But there is, I know not what being, who is possessed at once of the highest power, the deepest cunning, who is constantly employing all his ingenuity in deceiving me. That's the malignant. Doubtless then, I exist since I am deceived. The fact that being deceived is still evidence for Descartes that there's an I that's being deceived. And let him deceive me as he may, he can never bring it about that I am nothing, so long as I shall be conscious that I am something. And that's the key point there, you see. It's not just that I am enduring deception or I'm being deceived, but I have to be conscious that it is I who am being deceived, that there is a kind of unity there. And that is the genesis of what's called later self-consciousness, you see. For example, just to give you an example of how important that is, most of what's called consciousness generally is very often really self-consciousness. For example, Freud's notion of the unconscious is not the other of consciousness. It's the other of self-consciousness. The unconscious in Freud is a kind of consciousness. It's a form of consciousness. But it's a form of consciousness that cannot be brought back to a unified sense of self, you see. Just think of something like repression. For Freud, the unconscious, acts to some extent through repression. Repression could never function if it didn't know what it has to repress. Repression is object-directed. It's a teleological or intentional activity. That's why, for example, Lacan, one of the things he stresses is that the unconscious is a kind of thinking, you see. So what is it then that distinguishes the unconscious in the Freudian perspective from what is usually called consciousness? It's not the structure of consciousness, but rather, per se, but it's rather the structure of consciousness being unifiable, having a unified object, you see. And this is very interesting in regard to the dream. Freud distinguishes in the interpretation of dreams between what he calls daydreams and night dreams. Lacan will later call daydreams fantasies and so on. The difference is this. In the daydream, the dreamer occupies a unified position with respect to the dream. It's like, you know where you are and sort of what you're doing with respect to... So it is a kind of fantasy, really, in a certain sense. In the night dream, the position of the dreamer is impossible to localize in that stable, univocal way. There's no one point. Why? Because the dreamer is all over in the dream. The dreamer is not unified. The dreamer is the conflict of wishes or wish and anxiety, or however one wants to describe it. So that the dreamer, Freud says this, the dreamer can't be localized. And then so that, in other words, when you think of a night dream, you think of yourself as a spectator, remembering it and so on, after the fact. But from the Freudian point of view, at least, the position of the dreamer with respect to the dream is disseminated in the dream in various places, various parts, various wishes of the dreamer. It's a non-unifiable consciousness in the case of the unconscious there. And I think this is the important, this is what I would say is the important distinction between the day consciousness or self-consciousness. The word self is, again, a word we use, or is generally used, to describe a unified identity that's staying relatively the same over time. Doesn't mean it doesn't change, but it means that whatever the changes are, they will be encompassed by a kind of self-sameness, by a continuity, you see. Whereas in the unconscious, there is a multiplicity that can't be reduced to a harmonious unification, you see. And that's why the unconscious is structurally inaccessible to self-consciousness, because it is structurally incompatible with the unity that is usually expected from the notion of self. See? This is a rather important distinction, and I'm not sure that it is that Freud, for example, later in his writings, often starts out by saying, we talk a lot about consciousness. Do we really know what we're talking about? Consciousness is very complicated, he says. Anybody who thinks that they know that consciousness is simply the other of the unconscious has a very simple notion of what consciousness is. I think that what Freud is doing is distinguishing self-consciousness in the sense in which Descartes and others are using it from the unconscious, which is a multiple, non-unifiable, conflictual consciousness. It has multiple objects, you see, that are pulling in different directions and can't be brought together in a harmonious whole. Another example of this, in regard to the interpretation of dreams, a very interesting one, is what he calls secondary revision. Freud says that there's something called the dream work, in which the dream wish is not simply fulfilled, but has to be fulfilled in a way that makes it acceptable to self-consciousness, so that you remember it. Otherwise, you never remember it. You won't remember. You'll have no access to the dream. The only dreams you can talk about are dreams that you, in some way, you remember. And in order for you to remember a dream, it has to be minimally compatible with the demands of a unified self-consciousness. And one of the ways this goes on, because Freud supposes that the dream is the product of wish fulfillment, but not just any wish fulfillment, usually the fulfillment of a conflictual wish. Otherwise, you could have a fantasy during the day. You wouldn't have to relegate it to a night dream. and it wouldn't have the complexity of the dreams he's talking about either. He says one of the ways, he says there are two ways, two elements to this dream work, both of which are there in order to make the dream palatable to essentially to the waking spirit. One is what he calls considerations of representability. Awful word. It's Lacan. In German, it's called Rücksicht auf Darstellbarkeit. Yeah, Rücksicht is taking into consideration, and Darstellbarkeit, the word is Darstellung, is like representing something or something. Lacan has an equally complicated French translation, but very suggestive. He calls it considerations of staging. Considération de la mise en scène. Use the word mise en scène for that, you know. And in other words, things have to be made visualizable in a certain sense in order to be rememberable in the sense of traditional perception, that is, the representation of objects that seem to be relatively coherent. And the second way that happens is he talks about what he calls secondary revision. Actually, in German, it's sort of secondary processing, secondary Bearbeitung. And what happens there is that the essentially conflictual and chaotic sort of symbolizations of the dream that goes on in the unconscious are rearranged into a coherent narrative, so that you can tell a story. You know, I dreamt this happened and that happened and that happened, you know, and so on. And Freud says when you get that kind of a narrative, the things to look for are the breaks in the narrative, are the dark places, are the places where the coherent, consistent development of the narrative is interrupted. Because the narrative there is there in order to conceal, not to reveal. You see, but in order to impose what seems to be a kind of rational structure on something that is essentially conflictual and chaotic, non-unifiable, in that sense, teleological, because involving conflict and so on. And that's very interesting to me, at least, and because as far as I know, the connection has never been clearly made between a certain type of narrative storytelling and the repression, dream repression, and so on. And Freud says, for example, where dreams don't succeed in sufficiently revising themselves in this way, you're confronted with what seems to be a chaotic block or mass of thoughts, you know, a kind of assemblage that is incoherent. That's one of the ways, you know, things don't fit. So, and you know, maybe you've had this experience in remembering dreams about, you know, you remember a certain element that seems to be coherent, and at a certain point it breaks off, or it seems to be, you know, there are elements that come in that don't fit into the story, and you sort of try to usually forget about them because you don't know what to do with them. You know, they don't fit into the storyline of what you're remembering of the. For Freud, those are the interesting points. Those are the points that he would want to sort of have you think about, because that's going to lead you into this structure. So all of this is basically to talk about what I take to be very, very important in this whole complex here. With, you know, what is the structure of self-consciousness that underlies and informs this notion of the ego? And what I think it is it's the same structure as you have with it in the foundations that he's trying to create, something that is firm by staying the same over time, which means that it retains a certain unity despite the tendencies of temporal spatial displacement to introduce transformations and discordances and so on. And that even more, all of that is wrapped up in this one little word, I. The fact that, you know, I may be deceived, but since I'm deceived, it's not that I'm nothing, so long as I shall be conscious that I am something. And I exist is necessarily true each time it is expressed by me or conceived in my mind. And I think what's the problem there, what's going on, is that Descartes is treating the I as though it were an instantaneous agent that could absorb temporal change. So that as long as you're thinking, even though you say, I may know nothing, I'm being deceived, I'm in a world, I don't know anything that's going on, I'm still there. It's still I who am doing that. However, the problem is that, and this is where Nietzsche comes into the picture in a certain sense, it has to be the same I as the I that was there a moment ago, 2 moments ago, 3 moments ago. And if it's not that same I, if the I, in other words, implies a kind of synthetic memory over time that precisely is being called into question by this fact that anything that's outside of my thinking process, any object that's outside of it, is the reality of that is uncertain to me. I can't derive my existence from the existence of objects of consciousness, but from the fact that consciousness as such has an object. If you see what I mean? It's not the object per se, because that could be a fiction, could be a fantasy, could be a delusion, and so on. But the fact that I am conscious of something is evident that I am I, and that I am I, and that therefore I exist, and so on. And that implies something that Descartes doesn't deal with directly, interestingly enough, although it comes up in various ways, and that is the reliability of memory. You see, because, in other words, to put it in a crude way, an I that could only be thought of in a single moment as consciousness of this object, even if it's false, is not sufficient to say I. You can only say I a second time, a third time, in remembering and supposing a certain identity. There's an interesting thing, Freud says something analogous, where he's talking about what he calls reality testing. Freud says there's a thing called reality testing. It's not when you determine that an object is out there in the external world independently of yourself. It's when you determine that an object is still out there, that is, has remained identifiable despite temporal discontinuity or just temporal change, you see. And therefore it involves memory, you see. And that's why, for example, in cases, the increasingly frequent case of Alzheimer, where you have memory being destroyed, you really have the structure of the I is being very, very fundamentally attacked. It's not just say that, because the I consists of the ability to say that I am the same as I was, a minute ago, a day ago, and so on. When that becomes threatened, it produces very often huge anxiety and aggression. Not always the two, but anxiety and anxiety. I'll talk about this at some point later on in connection with the uncanny. Anxiety is, I think, from a Freudian point of view, there are different theories of anxiety, but the Freudian, particularly this later theory of anxiety is the reaction of the ego, the I, to a perceived or imagined threat. You see, to a danger. It's not the reaction to danger per se. It's the reaction of the I to a danger. That's very important. Freud, the important text there is called Inhibition, Symptoms, and Anxiety, dating from 1926, not a very long, but a very important text. And there, Freud says that, he's talking about the nature of anxiety, and he says it is not simply a response to danger. Why? Because there can be responses to danger that don't necessarily involve anxiety, and that can be much more efficient. You can't just derive anxiety in some sort of reflex way as a response to danger. From Freud's point of view, is that it's a response to a danger posed to the ego, which means to that instance which tries to establish some sort of unification in the psyche. So whatever is anticipated as threatening that unification can produce anxiety, and often will, you see. And so in a certain sense, what I'm doing here is to read Descartes a little bit against the grain. I'm almost sort of turning it inside out. I'm saying that his insistence on the self-evidence of the I is a way of his overcoming, or his answer to what I take to be a fundamental underlying anxiety that compels him to take these radical measures of, saying everything I've been taught, I've relied on, can't be relied on, and so on, and that There is, however, a bedrock. There is a point, and that point is that whatever quandary I find myself in, it's I who find myself in that quandary. You see, that's what he's but only as long as I am making my own thought processes an object of my thinking. You see, that's where its self-consciousness comes in. See, the idea is that it's not consciousness of an external object, it's conscious of my own thinking, reflexivity, as that which but as a unified project, you see. And what happens after that, and what constitutes the uncanny, is where that moment of reflex or of return does not come full circle, no longer provides the certainty of a kind of unity or identity. And where that happens, you get, the sense of uncanniness. Yeah.
Okay, so just going back to something you were talking about when you were talking about the I, it needs to be always the same. With the eternal recurrence, this is where, I don't know, I kind of disagree with my reading of it. It doesn't need to be, it can't be, the I cannot be the same. It has to include what was past.
Absolutely, I agree. No,
okay.
What I want to say, if I didn't say that clearly, what I want to say, and that's it's very important, is that the I has to provide an underlying continuity that includes change, that absorbs change.
But not same.
But no, certainly not. See, that's where that's where the I tries to be a response to the radical discontinuity of a Luther. You see, it's not faith in God, which is uncertain because it has a totally heterogeneous object. It is faith that I can think what I am thinking my thinking in a way that will reach an undercurrent, an underlying continuum, which I call I. So, and that's why the otherwise it would be totally incomprehensible how all the dynamism of modernity, which I think to be related to this, all the tremendous change and takes place would be understandable in this perspective, you see. Obviously, the modern period following Descartes is one of the most changeable, one of the most dynamic ones that has ever existed in many, many ways. However, my tendency is to interpret much of the thrust of that dynamism as a kind of defense mechanism trying to sustain a certain underlying unity and continuity in the face of a problem that may not be amenable to it, which is just to because you see, and I think to make it more concrete than that, the experience of time, the changed experience of time that you have after the Reformation, and this is, I think, is really crucial and connected also with anxiety, the uncanny, and everything else, is that time becomes a medium in which the relation of life and death is no longer that which is promised or hoped for in the Christian good news. That is, as something that will be self-transcending in an eternal continuum. Through a leap, through the end of the world, however it wants to be thought, but that life is life, first and foremost in the Creator prior to death, and that death is only a secondary aspect. You see, that's the position, and I think it's also the position of biopolitics, I would argue, in a different way. But that's the position that I feel that really isn't. That's why the insistence on the I is why this is not an epistemological, this is not an egological, this is a response to an anxiety of a living being who expects a kind of security in thinking that it can last or can return, and in fact is haunted by the fear that it may not, it may be, and that time is the crucial, and it's one of the crucial sort of dimensions in which this plays itself out, if you see what I mean. Time, so is time the medium in which a self matures and reaches maturity and fulfills itself, or is time simultaneously not the medium in which that maturity then turns into overripeness and ephemerality? And if so, where does that leave? Where does that leave an identity that in some sense is predicated on the promise of staying the same over time and space, returning? And that's what I take to be sort of characteristic, perhaps, of the Christian culture, even there where it is secularized, you see. So then the development of technology, the interest in power, the accumulation of wealth, and all of these things, always haunted by fears and terror and so on and so forth, is a kind of response to that unresolved cultural situation. I don't know if that I know this is terribly simplistic, but for me at least, it goes. It enables me to try to understand at a certain level certain things that are happening in the world and so on, and in different ways. That I don't know. Let me just. Our time is short. Let me just look at together with you at the piece of wax. Could that, in a way, also bring us on section 11, top of page 5 in our weekend, I guess it is, right? So he says, let us now consider the bodies that seem most clearly and distinctly known, the bodies we touch and see, not indeed bodies in general, for these general notions are usually somewhat more confused, but one body in particular. So you see, again, the important thing is that you must not resort directly to generic categories. It's not just wax. It's this wax here that I have in front of the fire in my room where this is all going on. It's the importance of this individuated scene. Take, for example, this piece of wax. It's quite fresh, having been but recently taken from the beehive. It's not yet lost the sweetness of the honey it contained. It still retains somewhat of the odor of the flowers from which it was gathered. Its color, figure, size are apparent to the sight. It's hard, cold, easily handled, and sounds when struck with the finger. In fine, all that contributes to make a body as distinctly known as possible is found in the one before us. But while I am speaking, and I've written a lot in Theatricality and Medium about the gerund and the present participle, which you notice come at the very moment that I'm doing this, something else is happening. The present participle is very important to me because it's the tense that suggests the fleetingness and the unfixability of the present. It's very different from the present indicative, something you can point to. It's something that involves participation in doing. And so on. So it's interesting to see where it comes up. But as I am speaking, while I am speaking, at the same time, let it be placed near the fire. What remains of the taste exhales, the smell evaporates, the color changes. The figure is destroyed, its size increases, becomes liquid, it grows hot. It can hardly be handled, and although struck upon, it emits no sound. Does the same wax still remain after this change? It must be admitted that it does remain. No one doubts it or judges otherwise. What then was it I knew with so much distinctness in the piece of wax? Assuredly it was nothing of all that I observed by means of the senses, since all the things that fell under taste, smell, sight, touch, and hearing are changed, and yet the same wax remains. You see. So here you get a kind of Platonic turn. The idea, it's the idea, the thought, the concept of the wax that allows you to identify this piece of wax as being wax. It's not your but that, so that again, sort of emphasizing that inasmuch as we are caught up in the singularity of physical time, spatial, temporal existence, we're not going to be able to reach that kind of stability and recognizability. It's only this appeal to a genre, in a certain sense, that allows us. And it's only the certainty that says, does anyone doubt that this is the same piece of wax? Even so, here's an example of what you were bringing up before about the change with the eyes, except that it's the wax that now stays the same. Of course, time is the medium of change and really of decomposition. It's not just change; it's decomposition, fluidification. It loses its stability, and so on. But the thought of the notion of wax still is invoked as what transcends what he calls a little bit further on an infinity of similar changes, and he sees that as being the result of an internal inspection, as he puts it at the bottom of the page, of my mind, which creates this this possibility. And then he goes on in the very next part, sentence 13, to continue to problematize this. Meanwhile, I feel greatly astonished when I observe the weakness of my mind and its proneness to error. For although without all giving expression to what I think, I consider all this in my own mind, words yet occasionally impede my progress. And I'm almost led into error by the terms of ordinary language. You see, language now comes into the picture in a way that anticipates some of what Nietzsche will say in Truth and Lies in an extramoral sense, only in a very skeptical way. Words may occasionally impede. We say, for example, that we see the same wax when it's before us, and not that we judge it to be the same from its retaining the same color and figure. Whence I should forthwith be disposed to conclude that the wax is known by the act of sight, and not by the intuition of the mind alone. So in other words, language then must be mistrusted if it's seen to designate things outside of us rather than signs of a thought process. Language is really only a thought process that indicates ideas, concepts that we have. And then he goes on to this next example, which remains, as a kind of transcends his use of it. Were it not for the analogous instance of human beings passing on in the street below, as observed from a window. So here he is looking down at these human beings in the street. In this case, I don't fail to say that I see the men themselves, just as I say that I see the wax. And yet, what do I see from the window beyond hats and cloaks that might cover artificial machines, whose motions might be determined by springs? But there's your uncanny valley, if you want, there. But I judge that there are human beings from these appearances, and thus I comprehend by the faculty of judgment alone, which is in my mind, what I believed I saw with my eyes, and so on. So what you have here are all the elements of a problem that Descartes thinks he has resolved, but that remains a problem already in the terms in which he's posed it, I think, and which will recur then in both philosophy and in even increasingly in literature, for example, Olympia and so on, but which already in the examples he's choosing are already palpable. I'm inferring from hats and cloaks that I'm really seeing something out there, but in fact, what am I seeing but these external things? I can't really trust them. So, my point here is that there's a powerful experience of uncertainty, obviously, that he is trying to get under control, and that there may very well be, and this is a structural, we can't go on here to do that, but a structural relationship between what he's attributing to the I and the later theological move to say it's God that guarantees it. In other words, the I is perhaps the way, in the form which he's trying to have it function, the secular heir to the divine, the unity of the deity, but under conditions that make it very, very problematic, right? Because the difference is that in God you have somehow an individuated entity that is universal, but in the I you have an individuated entity that is multiple, and that is not just multiple, but mortal, and so on, and that has to define itself in relation to other I's. That's what you get with Fichte, for example. Fichte talking about the simultaneous positing of the I and the not I. You see, there has to be in some other not I in order for there to be I, because the I is an individuated. It's not like, you could imagine that would be blasphemy in talking about a monotheistic God, I think. But it isn't in talking about a human I and so on. So that's and so in this sense, what is interesting for me here is that the way in which the I emerges here in this very sort of search for secure foundations as the instance which is going to be charged with guaranteeing the stability of the world and of knowledge in a situation in which the status of the singular remains precarious and perhaps unresolved. That would be the way I would, summarize that there.